Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. It is no surprise to any of us that we live in a time that is highly polarized. And there are numerous conversations that tend to revolve around a few key concepts, chief among which is the concept of identity, or at least one of the chief concepts. That discussion of modern policy, especially political conversation, really boils down to a kind of struggle for recognition. Joining me to have a conversation about this is Mitchell Bahnsen, student at Westmont College studying politics, philosophy, and economics, and he's also a research assistant at the California Policy Center. He's also the author of this article in The Public Discourse, Identity and Recognition Are the Polarized Policist's Chief Virtues. Mitchell, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Well, I'm glad to be able to speak with you, and I want to begin by asking you to help us define these concepts here, because the polarization that we're seeing right now is in large part due to, as you rightly diagnose, this problem of identity and therefore identity politics and policy. Share with us what that means.
Yeah, so I think it largely has to do with history. I think over time, our sense of self has changed. It's no longer about sort of the communities we're a part of, and it's moved much more inward. We've taken an inward turn to look at ourselves, how we feel, this idea of authenticity. And I think that's really moved. Like, identity is something that we have to constitute ourselves and discover within ourselves emotionally or otherwise, rather than the institutions that surround us.
I love that you draw from Charles Taylor's insight on the concept of the politics of recognition. And so this concept of a struggle for recognition, like you mentioned, we're looking inside. So what's the driving force here for modern man in terms of how we think about our political life?
Yeah, it is exactly that. It's a struggle for recognition. And our politics can't just be sort of, Thomas Jefferson has this line, what neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And that's no longer how people are thinking about politics. They're thinking, not only do you need to let me do what I want, but you need to sort of support it. You need to recognize it. You need to agree with it. And, basically a choice enhancement, not just a allowance of what I want to do with my own liberty.
In that light, then, as you're touching on the issue of the common good, there was a point where everyone in the Republic thought of politics along the language of the common good. Help us understand, what is the common good, and why should we reframe the way we think about our politics?
Yeah, I think the common good does vary from culture to culture, and I think that we see in the United States today, even if we had less of that identity turn, it would still look different than the Greek city-states or the medieval Europe, for example. But I still think, we don't have a moral identity. We don't have this grounding in our institutions, whether that's faith or community. We're sort of become autonomous, so we lack that. So I think a common good, it looks like a more institutional expression of our community life, and preferably it is something that's religious, where we have moral commitments that are shared. And I think, we've lost a lot of that with our autonomous methodology here.
And you rightly highlight, going back to Charles Taylor's essay, The Politics of Recognition, we've moved in terms of our focus of the political paradigm. We used to operate under honor, and then in the age of enlightenment, it was a question of dignity, and now authenticity. Help us see that shift. Help us understand how we're living in that shift now.
Yeah, so I think honor used to be, it's intrinsically linked to inequalities. It's like, you have feudalism, you have the vassals, you have that sort of like, it's scarce to have honor, but those who do are in a very high status, and it demands distinction. And then this move to dignity, it's universal, it's egalitarian. Everyone shares human dignity, and it's only possible in democracy. I think that it's something that our Western tradition has really emphasized, of like, we all share human dignity, and I think it's a very good thing. And it leads to equal status in culture and, gender and all these things, these, progresses that we appreciate as, Western people. But I think when we go too far with that, of making dignity not only just equal recognition of status, we can go very much too far of, you have to agree with every choice I make. And I want to feel like, every decision, whether moral or immoral or otherwise, just completely, it has to be sort of maintained by everyone else around me, even when those values conflict deeply. The nice thing about ideal of dignity is that we can have different values, and we can still respect one another and still have conversations when we need to with policy. But but when we go beyond dignity to recognition and authenticity, it's just a complete, a mess of conflicting visions that do not coexist well with one another.
Now, precisely because of that concept of a mess, then, we need to reclaim a non-messy, non-chaotic view of culture and society. So what would Taylor say would be a better way of redefining the cultural mood?
Yeah, I think Taylor is much more descriptive than he is prescriptive, but he is a communitarian. He would say we need to move back to a more local vision, where we have, communities that do have shared moral values. And I think that's what we see for much of American history. We have big ideals and a federal government, but federalism involves, the states have hopefully more power. It's sort of this Catholic principle of subsidiarity would be a helpful way of thinking about it. Of the local smallest level is usually the one we want to start with. And as we need to deal with larger issues, we can talk about that. But on the individual level, yeah, you have this community cohesion, you have this constrained vision where people, the limits of human nature are thought about. And then in our local communities, we can decide how we want to live our lives and with our political goods and move up from there as needed.
Tell us more then how we're not exactly living that, especially with the concept of dignity, this newfound sense of dignity.
Yeah. Well, I think dignity has been expanded much further beyond what the Enlightenment sought out to do. I think you saw traces of it with someone like John Locke, but when you move to so much further, like 20th century liberal thinkers like John Rawls, for example, it just gets completely blown out of the water where you bring in these Immanuel Kant categoricals where we now live in a veil of ignorance and we sort of are blind. Dignity does, recognize individuality, but when you go too far with that concept of making it a total veil of ignorance where you have to recognize someone but also be blind to the distinctives, there's sort of a contradiction in terms there.
In that contradiction in terms, how much did the work of thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau affect the way we think about dignity today?
Yeah, very much. And that whole romanticism is a big part of what we're talking about. I use this phrase in the essay, le sentiment de l'existence, my sentiment of existence. There's sort of this romanticized inner self, and that idea, again, going back to the authenticity, that is very much prioritized over even thinking about communal life or, this is for my family, this is with my church. It's become much more, what's inside me? How do I express it well? And you see that with poets in the Romantic movement. And there's beautiful poetry. There's something very good about this sort of Augustinian understanding of the self, but we push it very far with Rousseau to where it's completely blind to our communal commitments.
And how is that blindness to communal commitments affected what, Carl Trueman, whom I'm sure you're aware of, he talks about expressive individualism when he thinks of Rousseau.
Right.
Yeah, tell us about that, please.
Yeah, expressive individualism. It's all about what's inside of me. Kind of, again, Trueman is very much a disciple of Taylor in this way. We have this turn where Truman uses this great example of my grandfather made shoes, and he didn't do that because he found self-fulfillment. I mean, he did, but only in the sense that he can put food on the table for his kids and pay the rent and that sort of thing. And it was about, what's around him. I want to go to church on the weekends. I want to, find fulfillment in my work, but not for the sake of this sort of amorphous, spiritualized, self inside of me that has to be actualized. It's much more about, in our communal life, in our temporal life, separate from our spiritual life, we find fulfillment because of the people and the institutions that God has placed in the world. It isn't just about finding some mystery self inside of me that has to be experimented with and, the expressions of which we see all over our culture today, especially in specific social movements.
So that concept of this constant movement inward, or as you rightly highlight, an inward generation, there's a real problem there because human beings are not meant to live that way.
Exactly, yeah. And I think Augustine's a helpful, you can go back, and I'm a big fan of Augustine, but he talks about the road to God as passing through our own self-awareness.
So let's pause there, Mitchell. The music is hitting, but I do want to hear your thoughts on the other side. My guest has been Mitchell Bahnsen, student at Westmont College studying politics, philosophy, economics, and he is a research assistant at the California Policy Center. We are talking about this modern notion of identity and recognition as reasons for our cultural and social polarization. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Beatham, talking with Mitchell Bahnsen, author of the article Identity and Recognition Are the Polarized Policist's Chief Virtues in the Public Discourse. Mitchell, you were just beginning to tell us about this overt concept of expressive individualism and what that does with regard to how a person lives in society.
Yeah, so I think, again, going back historically, if we take this Augustinian idea of the road to God as passing through our own self-awareness, that beautiful language in the Confessions, we think of that as a very good thing, of knowing ourselves in order to know God. I think that no one would disagree with the goods in that. But the original reason to do that is, as Taylor talks about, it's a means to the end of acting rightly in order to, do this in society within the institutions. But the new view that sort of has taken over with this idea, going to its extremes, is the displacement of the moral accent. Being in touch with our feelings becomes an end in itself. It's a prerequisite to be a true and full human being, no longer in order for me to serve my community or participate in church life.
Now, what does that do then for the concept of a social fabric, especially in our republic, which was designed not to have power flowing from the top down, and so the collective sense of the masses has a huge bearing on the direction of the nation?
Absolutely it does, yeah. And I think we see the trouble of that today, where we can't agree on our, the ends even. We used to, I think most people who grew up maybe in the 1980s and 90s would say, we all want the same things, but we just have different ways of getting there, small government, big government. Whereas now I think it's much more, what does it mean to be human? We don't even have the same definitions of like what a good life, a good democracy consists in. And I think that fracturing is a real consequence of this coming to its fully grown form.
You see this in a lot of the social movements that are rising and taking over the public sphere now. Many of what we might define as the progressivist movements. You highlight the transgender movement, the LGBTQ movement. Help us understand the ideological forefathers that led to this, so that we know they didn't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think you can point to many things, and all of this, nothing exists in a vacuum. History is complicated, and I want to avoid those reductionisms as much as possible. But I would say Rousseau is a big part of it, sort of drawing out these extreme, like, romantic notions. And I think other Enlightenment thinkers, you can even look at John Locke. John Locke has this paper he wrote in, I think, A Letter Concerning Toleration, where he talks about the parish life doesn't even need to be spiritual. He despiritualizes it to where, we're just trying to get along, and, institutions are good. And John Locke's an early part in that causal chain that we get to now. But I think you see those traces in the Enlightenment that lead now to this full fracturing. And the sexual revolution, of course, plays a big part in that, of our sexual identity becoming something that's even in question in a way that it wasn't before. So, yeah, I think there's many strands that come together in this modern social movement.
One of the things that you rightly highlight, too, is how now, because of this mindset, if you so much as say a word against the logic of it, it's constituting an act of violence. Can you please speak to that?
Yeah, I think that sort of is the crux of this, and that's sort of what prompted me to write the article. Of people are no longer thinking of violence as like, my physical, they'll say my physical safety, but it's really not. It's, if you offend me, if you say something to me that hurts my sense of selfhood, you're attacking me as a person in a way that they would compare or say is attacking them physically, which is not true. It isn't genuine coercion that is happening when someone maybe questions transgender ideology or promotes free speech, but it's become that since we think of ourselves as this inwardly constituted emotional identity only, kind of at the expense of biological and communal commitments, who's to say that it's not an attack on their very selfhood or their very personhood?
And therein lies the issue, because without a reclamation of a more public view of my role in society, if I become more and more individualistic, then all of society winds up creating this chaotic, continued fragmentation. Help us see that.
Yeah, I think that this honestly could get worse before it gets better. A lot of people want to talk about it, and at least it's something that's on the table for people of religious commitments and who care about community, even the non-religious. But I think at the same time, this is a phenomenon that is sort of started on the left, but you're seeing move to the right. I think you can see it in traces throughout, right-wing politics today of, people talk about the woke right, for example. I think that carries many of these same sociological contours, just in a different flavor, a different packaging.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And if you would like to speak to that, please show us how it really is the same principles, just applied in the overt extreme.
Yeah, I think, everyone wants to talk about a figure like President Trump, but I think he captures this well. He sort of seizes on the moment of seeing people feel alienated and disconnected from community. So he's like, I'll bring you in, because ultimately human beings have a social nature. So if they do feel alienated by the individualism and the lack of robust, thick communal commitments, it's easy to be swept up in this. We're going to, it gives a common enemy. We're going to destroy the left, and we're going to feel good about ourselves. And I don't think that, there's plenty about the left I would love to destroy myself, but I think the way he does it is not one that brings back these communal commitments. And I think people on the right who want to question free speech, who want to say, sort of just do the same thing as the left, but in their, like I said, flavor, or the vibe shift that people like to talk about, I think you're going to have disastrous consequences, just like we've had on the left.
That's a really crucial point that you make, and that's why it's important to identify that it's not a matter of conservative or liberal in terms of moral policy, thought, or social infrastructure. We really are talking about political movements here. So there's an identitarian reality to, for example, the MAGA movement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that there's plenty about Republican politics that I think many people can get behind, and I am a right-leaning conservative, but I think, the sort of cult-like nature of the MAGA movement speaks very strongly to this phenomenon I'm describing, even if I would agree with some of the policies of the administration and that sort of thing.
And really what we're seeing is, like you rightly mentioned, an overreaction, an overcorrective, if you will, to the kind of expressive individualism and extreme autonomy that we've seen coming out of extreme progressivism.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's sort of, Thomas Sowell has this great book called A Conflict of Visions, and he describes the unconstrained vision being this utopia. If we just put the pieces in the right place politically, everything will be great. And then you have the constrained vision, which says, no, there are limits to human nature. I think you see on the left and the right now a lot of unconstrained visions in different ways, different pieces that they want to put into place. But as someone myself, and I think as most religious people are, we have a view of sin. We have a constrained vision where we can't build that utopia. So that conflict of visions encapsulates much more than left and right, but it does, go to show what I'm talking about here.
It completely does, and therefore I invite you to speak also to, I want to be careful as I phrase this concept of a class difference, like you highlight, the coastal elites. Many of the commentators and influencer types, actors, elites, what have you, their impression of what's going on in society is frankly divorced of a contact with the reality of the everyday American, and that has to be taken into account as well.
Absolutely it does. I think some of the looking down upon the non-coastal elites from the coastal elites leads a lot into this populist movement of like, they don't understand us, they don't understand our religious values, they don't understand our stronger views on sexual ethics. It completely is a fracturing there, because it's like we're all in the same country. We're trying to achieve political ends, but we just have completely different views of the world. And our ethics, our morality is divorced from one another. So I think that is a huge part of our problem here.
In the face of this, you quote Alexis de Tocqueville about public opinion as a sort of mistress whose slaves the men of democratic ages are. Just help us apply that to how we think about our social fabric today.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest example everyone wants to talk about is something like social media. Our public opinions are much more publicized than they've ever been before. So, yeah, when everyone can go on X anonymously and just say everything they think, even if they're, completely trolling and saying things that they don't even believe, it's like there's too many voices in the ring in order to actually achieve stuff, get stuff done. You see this in Congress all the time, these ridiculous hearings where they're just sort of trying to get a soundbite for TikTok or for TV, and you miss out on the chance to really legislate and really, again, seek after these ends that we all want to pursue. I think if you have a one-on-one conversation with an American on the other side of the aisle from you, you'll find way more commonality than you would expect if you were just looking at social media.
That actually is true, because we've created these digital echo chambers where none of our thoughts are held to accountability, and that cannot be good for the flourishing of the republic.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the algorithms don't help. These big companies, there is somewhat of an incentive of I go on X and I see stuff I want to see. So I think that we're getting out of those bubbles and actually going out into the world and seeing people, talking to people, and including those challenging conversations with people I disagree with. I have a lot of friends on campus that we very much disagree politically, but they're some of my favorite people to talk to. It's an opportunity to see the world through a different lens. I'm not going to agree with all of their beliefs, but really understanding one another, that is, I think, a Christian principle and a healthy democratic principle that we could all benefit from.
And how does doing that help you actually become a better Christian, but also be a better citizen in the Republic?
Yeah, I mean, Christian, it's easy. Love your neighbor. And we could say pray for those who persecute you. In this case, no one's actually persecuting anyone. We just have some credential differences. So the Christian side's easy. The Democratic side, it's a little tricky because I think we again, many of us, I think, want the same things, but very different beliefs on how to get there. And I think when there's a lot of, power and money and different things in the mix, it's hard to delineate between what's what, and there's a confusion of categories that happens. But I think in general, if we have open dialogue with one another, and I think our legislators are incentivized by, the voters saying, hey, we want things to get done. We don't want just these media headlines taking over. I think that will lead to a productive improvement in our democracy just by those conversations.
Mitchell, thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to future conversations as well.
Thank you.
My guest has been Mitchell Bahnsen, student at Westmont College studying politics, philosophy, and economics, research assistant at the California Policy Center. We've been talking about the notion of identity politics as one of the sources of why we're so polarized and divided. And Mitchell's counsel is actually really good. Let's make the effort to have good faith, reasonable conversations with individuals who don't share opinions and belief with us, and let's grow together. I'm Marcus Peter.